All right. Welcome to the Deploy Securely podcast, where we go deep on the security, compliance, and privacy implications of using AI. I'm your host, Walter Haydock, founder and CEO of StackAware. Today, I'm joined by Matt Adams. Matt is the head of Security Enablement at Citi, one of the world's leading financial institutions. With nearly 2 decades of experience in information security, he's at the forefront of driving security innovation across emerging technologies like generative AI, blockchain, and quantum computing. An innovator at heart, he actively develops tools that harness the power of generative AI for various cybersecurity applications, including threat modeling, incident response, and security awareness. Matt, thanks so much. Welcome to the show. Welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Walter. Great to be here.
Awesome. So to start out, over the past few years, we've seen an explosion in AI-driven capabilities, but also security risks and regulatory requirements. At a high level, I know we talked about this a little bit beforehand, but can you give me your perspective on the macro view here?
Yeah, so I think for me, November 2022 release of ChatGPT was a massive watershed. And it feels like since that point, months in AI have become more like dog months, the pace that things are going at. And we've seen huge advances in natural language processing, computer vision, Gen AI, robotics, and there's an aspect to which that these are all self-reinforcing technologies. So if you combine a more advanced natural language processing plus better computer vision plus more dexterous robotics, you suddenly get some pretty amazing use cases in terms of robots that can go out into a very dynamic and changing environment and operate on a more natural basis with humans. And that's something that clearly we've never had before. I think, my overall perspective is I try and constantly remind myself that we're still at the really early stages of this fourth industrial revolution. And while my day-to-day focus is on how do we really leverage generative AI for different processes and improvements across security, I think I'm always mindful that the progress that we're making today, while it may feel like we're not going quite fast enough, I always like to think about that quote from Bill Gates where he talks about, we constantly overestimate the amount that we can do in 2 years and underestimate the amount that we can do in 10. And it feels like, with that 2-year anniversary of ChatGPT coming up, it feels like we're living that very much at the moment.
Absolutely. Yeah, I like the dog months saying. I think that's quite apt. So we had a good kind of quick conversation right before we went live about the regulatory landscape and your thoughts on that. Can you touch on some of the key pieces of legislation, their implications for business, and how they would interplay with each other from an AI perspective?
Yeah, so I mean, the key piece of legislation that I think most people who are thinking about this area are aware of is the EU AI Act, which recently came into force. There's an adoption period of a couple of years still to go, and that's really a risk-based regulatory framework. So it's looking at what are your use cases for AI as an organization, and there are some in a very top tier which are prohibited within the EU or for use cases that involve EU citizens in other jurisdictions, and those would be things like large-scale social scoring, by governments or organisations. Then you've got a high-risk tier where you're looking at more decision making, automated decision making using AI about individuals, so perhaps credit decisions. And then you've got the lower tiers, which are more on the sort of interactive chatbot scale, and then finally there's a lowest tier which is really around things that don't meet the bar. They're pretty straightforward use cases, low risk, and as I say, that's the sort of key piece of legislation that's out there. It's probably the most mature. In the US, things are a little bit more fragmented. So there was the executive order, the presidential executive order in 2023, which set out some key principles. But since then, we've seen a more decentralized approach at the state level. So, in particular, I think California has been very active with their AI legislation or regulations. And that's had a bit of a mixed reception. So, particularly some within the industry are looking at the focus of the regulation on the model provider and the fact that they would need to guarantee that their models aren't used for malicious or undesirable purposes. That's quite a shift from other regulation and legislation that I personally am aware of. So my view is that typically when governments have regulated in the past, what's happened is that you've regulated the outcomes rather than the technology itself. So, we never got into the position where Dell or IBM or HP were being taken to court because someone used one of their laptops for hacking. But that seems to be the stance that the kind of California legislature are taking at the moment, which is you as the model trainer need to say that this model is safe and it can't be used for those unintended consequences, which I think is a really challenging bar to set, because we're dealing with a technology that is as general purpose as I think almost any technology that I've come across is. You can turn a language model to many tasks. Some of those it's better at than others, but it will certainly have a go and do that. And there aren't that many technologies that have that kind of scale and breadth behind them.
Yeah, I definitely think that's a good point, that the AI regulation, specifically in the United States, is getting far more prescriptive, focusing more on the tactical details of things than prior legislation had. You mentioned the executive order from the U.S. government, and primarily that's focused on the executive branch, but it does actually leverage some existing legislation like the Defense Production Act to require certain industries to provide the physical location of certain computing systems and things like that, and also undergo some types of testing and red teaming. And it's very prescriptive. And you're also seeing that with the California bill as well. So definitely agree with that point. Now, specifically drilling down into the world of financial services, obviously there's a huge regulatory burden wherever you are, whether it's in England, in the EU, in the United States. Can you say a little bit more about the challenges and some of the regulations that you're facing, that you're seeing in the industry, and how you're dealing with them?
Yeah, and I think I touched on this in my previous answer a little bit, but the complexity of that regulatory landscape really makes it a challenging proposition from businesses that are operating across multiple jurisdictions or have customers in multiple countries and continents even. And there's an element to which I expect that the regulations will continue to evolve. There was some interesting comments, I think, from the lead technical author of the EU AI Act a few weeks ago, where he appeared to be suggesting that he'd almost gone, or he felt the regulation had gone too far in terms of stifling innovation. And I think that was in response to the announcement that was made by Meta, where they were quite clear to say that they were not going to release some of their multimodal models, the latest generation, that they didn't expect to provide them within the boundaries of the EU. And I think when you look at that balance of regulation and innovation, it's not obviously desirable to stifle innovation on that level, to the point where there isn't that general access to leading edge models, because that's not great for the consumer, it's not great for the person in the street, and ultimately there are still going to be other countries that are pushing ahead and doing very innovative things, and so there's an extent from a geopolitical situation where you can't apply the brakes too heavily, because you are going to lose pace with that with those competitors.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, please.
No. I was just thinking more about some of the other, the non-AI specific regulation that we also think about. So there's regulation for AI, and then there's also how existing regulation is impacted by the emergence of these new technologies and the increasing adoption. And from that standpoint, from a financial services view, things like GDPR, DORA, they're still highly relevant, and have the potential to be impacted by a company's use of AI. So if you're processing EU citizens' data through your AI solution, even if it's not for one of those high-risk use cases, you've still got to cover all of those GDPR bases and make sure that you're compliant. And the same for an operational resilience standpoint. So if you're providing key services and that's backed by AI, you still have those requirements that you need to be cognizant of.
Yeah, 100%. Something that we were chatting about is how for basically any organization that's leveraging any sort of digital services and especially AI, you may need a structured database that says, okay, this system meets this definition under this piece of legislation. Here are requirements, and that's actually something that StackAware is working on, is building a structured way to represent these types of things. I actually think that's a good segue to the next question, which is shifting gears a little bit, but I know you've worked on open source projects like the OWASP AI Security Controls Graph and the EU AI Act Requirements Graph. Can you talk a little bit more about these open source projects and specifically how they can use them to secure their AI deployments and keep them compliant?
Yeah, so these projects really came from a place of wanting to help people understand the complexity of the legislation, the regulations that were coming up. And I'd seen others go through this process of trying to map out the individual clauses of let's take the EU AI Act as an example. So there are multiple interlinked clauses within that regulation where if you are a high risk company, according to paragraph 12, 15, then you then need to apply this, the subset of clauses from paragraph 18, subsection X, and you quickly becomes quite difficult to pass that as a piece of regulation and understand what your obligations are. And to some extent, I've seen this in large organizations with their own security policies, where the documents become so complex and so lengthy, with multiple interrelated clauses, that it's really difficult for employees to wrestle with. And I'd seen some people experimenting with loading policies into this kind of graph database structure, and so it just seemed like an ideal opportunity to experiment with this graph database structure. And what that gives you is a really visual and dynamic way of exploring these regulations. So once you've created your database, think of it like any other database. You can run queries against it, and so you can say, tell me, if I uplifted these controls, which elements of this standard or regulation would that impact? Or if you were starting from scratch and you were planning your EU AI Act compliance program, you would look at, well, tell me all of the, what could I do to give me the most bang for my buck in meeting these requirements? And to one of the points you mentioned earlier, I think one of the most impactful things that you get from looking at that analysis is you need to go and build your AI inventory. If you don't have one, you absolutely need to understand where AI is being used within your company and for what purposes, and then that really spans out. And you can see this in this graph visualization. Really spans out to improving your posture against a number of the requirements if you can provide a good basis for understanding where AI is and how you're using it and for what purposes. So that was really the basis for both of those projects. So it was it's a very similar idea around the OWASP tool as well. OWASP, and I'm a member of OWASP, but the guys working on that project already did a great job trying to explain how all of those individual recommendations and controls fitted together. But I just looked at it and thought, wow, this is really complex. This is something that I think would be far better explored in this kind of graph structure. And yeah, it was enthusiastically adopted by the the maintainers of that particular project. So yeah, great to help out.
Yeah, I think the point about the AI inventory is something that I harp on a lot. And there are a lot of companies that don't even have a firm grasp about what assets they have in their network, what their vendors are doing with AI. And if you can get a handle on that and combine it with a project like yours, a structured database that shows your requirements and your risks and the controls you can take to mitigate them, that is a really powerful thing. So I'm happy you made that available to the community. So since this is a live event, we did get a question from Patrick Sullivan, who I know quite well and is a quite a thought leader in the space. And he asked a very tough question that I'll turn to you, but feel free to kick it back to me in case you don't want to comment on it. But what he said is that with HIPAA, we saw many business associates trying to stand behind a conduit exception, saying that they were merely a conduit for sensitive information, PHI, presumably in this case. And then he said we saw a similar argument for social media platforms prior to the most recent U.S. elections. And they do have some legal protections under some existing statutes in terms of exempting them from liability for content that is posted there. The question is, do you think that this approach will be adopted by some of the foundational model providers, and will this be defensible? So would love to hear your response, but feel free to kick
back. Yeah, I mean, that's a really, really interesting question. I'm trying to think about it's like Section 230, isn't it, in the US for the like the common carrier type regulation? I listen to far too many tech podcasts about this, and I think there will still be. I'm trying to think through the implications for most companies certainly don't train these models themselves. And most companies that I'm aware of are currently running the models on hosted platforms. And I think there will be T's and C's around AWS, Vertex AI, Watson X, which will say, you shouldn't be using this for illegal purposes or generating unacceptable content, whatever the terms of service for that are. And so I don't think that would go back to the model provider. You'll almost get caught by the T's and C's of that platform. Now, clearly, there are uncensored models that exist out there. So typically, they're run on local hardware. It will be really interesting to see where that California SB 1047, I think it was, gets to. Because how big is the reach of that particular regulation? As a model trainer, would you get stopped at the point of landing at in San Francisco for that? I just don't think we've got good answers to this at the moment, and how active the regulation of that is going to be in practice.
Yeah, I think the enforcement question is something that's quite interesting, and you alluded to this. Like, if you in the future there may be models that you could train, meeting the teraflops requirements for SB 1047, and that in 5 years actually might be quite a trivial amount of computing power. Maybe an individual could bring it to bear. What do you do? Are you going to be searching people's phones when they come into the airport to see if they have these contraband models on them? I think we had a very similar debate in the United States it kind of has been going on for 30 years or so with no resolution, even though I think the answer is quite clear in my mind in terms of end-to-end encryption that doesn't have any sort of law enforcement access. I obviously I worked in counterterrorism in a previous life, and have spent some time on the policy side on Capitol Hill. And obviously, I am a big staunch defender of American national security and law and order. But at the same time, I think any sort of regime where you have the requirement to inspect the code on something coming into the United States or even a given state, that's going to break down quite quickly, and it's going to be very, very challenging to enforce. You're just not going to have the technical expertise, or the it's not going to be feasible from the physical perspective. So, I definitely agree with you that the enforcement will be quite challenging. I do think that some of the companies will try to make these types of arguments. I think they'll say, hey, we just designed it. We didn't necessarily use it for various reasons. I certainly am going to see that, but it'll be interesting to see how these things play out. So thanks for your response on that. I know that was a calling an audible. So going back to kind of the corporate perspective and approach, what do you think some of the highest return on investment steps that companies could take concretely when it comes to AI governance and security these days?
So we've already touched on one of them, so I'll cover that first. But that AI inventory, I think, is absolutely essential for businesses that want to start to embrace AI and continue, perhaps. So it may be that they've already started to embrace it, but they're just not aware. And anecdotally, I've had conversations with a few CISOs that have been into meetings with data science teams and have had the conversation of, so we're not running any of these models in production, right? And they then get some quizzical expressions back. They go, well, actually, we've maybe got 10, and well, if you use a certain definition, maybe we've got 50 models out there. So yeah, being really clear on where AI is used. I think one of the real benefits for security of this last couple of years and the amount of focus that's been on Gen AI is that security teams have had to then start to take a closer look at the parts of their business that deal with machine learning and data science, and things that perhaps where they didn't have the time or the bandwidth to really get in and understand what is it that you're doing with these models, what are the potential risks that are around those PyTorch files, or the different the different types of software that you've got, the different libraries that get used in that space. That has now been moved much higher up the priority agenda because there's a lot of overlap with the Gen AI world, which is almost becoming priority number one for some businesses in terms of how they're approaching it. So yeah, so definitely that inventory piece. I think also then, and bearing in mind the nature of this conversation is around governance, I think having that governance maturity roadmap is also really good ROI in terms of being able to have that guidance around the overall development and understanding where you're going, where you need to prioritize your resources and just time, budget, all of those things that go into running projects. And I think lastly, probably a really good AI policy or framework to follow as well. We've already gone past the point of adoption by a lot of people, whether they know it or not. And I mean that in the sense of shadow AI in the enterprise. So I think one of the challenges that, from a security standpoint, on like a day-to-day operations issue, is how easy it is now to get data out of companies because of how good these models are at the OCR or multimodal inputs. So even a smartphone photo of a screen now from somebody working at home, you could easily go through 10, 20, 40 pages of documentation in very short order, whereas previously you would never have really been able to get that out through email or file transfer services. And so, yeah, having that AI policy, letting people know where they stand, having a way to give approved access for certain use cases, I think that's all really good stuff for people to look at.
So sounds like the basics, having a policy, having security team involvement with business processes, having an inventory are the key things. The boring but key things.
And just to extend on that, so there's a lot of excitement around Gen AI in particular, and there are some definite unique challenges about working with probabilistic systems. So everyone's familiar with hallucinations. We've also got prompt injection, but there's a lot of overlap with existing problems that we've been wrestling with in security for 2-3 decades. So prompt injection is another injection attack, just like SQL injection. And if you're looking at how do you validate the inputs to those models, that gets you quite a long way to solving that problem. And just good web application security in general will cover a lot of bases when it comes to Gen AI. Yes, there are some subtleties, there are some differences, but yeah, I think it comes back to doing the basics well, whether that's on the technical side or on the governance and policy side. I still think that's AI isn't sufficiently different to take away the need for those fundamentals.
All makes sense. All makes sense. So moving on to some things that are further off in the horizon, what do you think is the biggest risk that is not on people's radars when it comes to leveraging AI in a secure and compliant manner that we haven't talked about, but something that maybe keeps you awake at night?
Yeah, so I think there are some interesting questions around when companies begin to deliver, and we're starting to see this, but as they begin to deliver those early use cases, while they're low risk, they can still be incredibly powerful and they can be impactful on certain other parties. So I'll use an example that I often think about, which is there are tools out there that will let you upload a supplier assurance questionnaire. So the typical sort of third-party assurance questionnaire that loads of companies use day in, day out. There are thousands of these things floating around large organizations. And when you're able to ingest those responses and pass them using a generative model, and then have that model identify where the gaps are against your existing standards and policies, the model doesn't understand not having enough time to do those questions. So in the same way that a person probably reading through that will go, yeah, they've maybe not quite hit the mark. They may be 90% there. I feel like they're okay. So let's just say, yes, that's accepted. Because they know that they need to move on and do other stuff and other work during that day. The models have no problem with that. So they will just say, yeah, this doesn't meet exactly what we wanted, so we're going to ask you for more information. And if you as a purchaser of those services dealing with a supplier, if you can ask 1,000 follow-up questions to satisfy your own risk appetite, the question is, should you do that? From the broader ecosystem perspective and having the impact on that supplier. You could absolutely sink a small supplier in paperwork through not really intending to do that. And I think there's going to be quite a few examples of that where if you can't match your counterparty's use of AI, then there are going to be some quite large discrepancies and additional friction caused by that. So that's sort of one of the things that is probably a little bit further out there. But definitely something that I think about. I also think then, again, maybe just a little bit further out than that, when you take away those simple tasks or simpler tasks. So I started my career doing technology assurance for a Big Four audit firm. And I learned a lot about different technologies, AS400 mainframes, Novell systems, stuff that people have forgotten about completely by now. But I did that by going around different companies and having that exposure and doing the low level audit work that gave me exposure to that. I think we're very soon within the next year or two, easily, where that kind of role will be largely replaced by a model being able to process and ask those questions. And so the impact that that has over the longer term is, where is that junior auditor coming from? Where are they getting those skills? How will they then turn into your senior auditor, who can then understand what the edge cases are and what to do in that, where they do come up against a system that they haven't come across before? And so, yeah, that again, like, I think about over reliance on AI systems from that perspective, and not from a they're going to get the answer wrong, but from a de-skilling of the workforce perspective, and think about, like, how do we maintain that pipeline of people coming through, building on the knowledge, and not just offloading everything to the model to do.
Yeah, those are two very interesting risks that I think are not on a lot of people's radars. And kind of the first one you mentioned, it's not quite model collapse, where a model is training on synthetically generated or AI generated data, and then just the quality of responses gets worse and worse. But it's similar to that, and you could have kind of content collapse, where potentially you could have two AI systems from different organizations communicating with each other, and eventually you kind of get into absurdity, where maybe one company has a requirement that the other be privacy shield compliant, which of course has been invalidated, is no longer a valid framework. But maybe one company has a requirement that the other confirm compliance, and then maybe its AI system is saying, hey, the supply or the customer's demanding that we have privacy shield compliance, like, let's kick off this project to start getting compliant, when it's a framework that's been invalidated. It's been replaced by the data protection framework. You could see a lot of absurd actions certainly arising from that sort of AI, taking it too literally and not applying common sense, certainly. So as we're moving toward the end of our time, I'd love to hear from you, who the top minds in AI governance and security are. Obviously you have a solid presence on LinkedIn. You've got the open source projects. Who else are you following to stay up to date with, and to kind of get these long-term, these over-the-horizon type risks from?
Yes, I think there's a lot of value at the moment in such a new space, and a space that's moving so quickly. I find YouTube to be an amazing resource, quite frankly. So the sort of quality content providers on there, who are really going in and building projects and showing practical use cases. I've got a big focus on highlighting practical use cases for Gen AI in security. And so I definitely get a lot out of watching those sorts of videos. And Medium as well, an amazing resource. Again, perhaps the quality can sort of vary, so you've got to sort of pick and choose. I don't find their algorithms to be quite as good at surfacing the right kind of thing, but I've lost track of the number of times where I'm thinking about how to apply a new technology or a new library, and searching through Medium will find an example of somebody that's done something very similar. So I think that's a really really helpful resource. And I'm deliberately not calling out particular names, because I think there's so many good people out there that are doing this, and just a general search on those platforms will help to find that. I think from a more formal, more recognized sources, the teams at OWASP are doing some great work. And again, there's no necessarily particular rock star figures to call out. I think there's been some amazing collaborative efforts across the community. So whether that's the top 10 list for LLM systems, or whether it's the AI cybersecurity governance checklist, those are really good documents. There's a lot of man hours that have gone into those, and a lot of good thinking. And that's who I see kind of leading the thought making on this area.
Got it. All right, I think we can sneak in one more question, and this is something about the myths of AI governance and security. So what would be a commonly held but mistaken belief that folks have, whether they're in the security and compliance community, whether they're on the business side, whether even on the technology side, what do you think is a big myth out there?
Probably the same as, again, going back to our point on fundamentals and covering that. Um, for a long time, and I've been doing cybersecurity for nearly 20 years, and different standards have come and gone during that time. And I think most people have moved beyond the idea that compliance with a standard means security. There are still some of those that think we've met our 27001 and 27002 requirements, we're secure. But I think I'm seeing people fall into a similar trap with the AI regulations, because so little is known about this, and so few people have like real practical experience of delivering these systems, that I think it's comforting to have a regulation that you can refer to and say, okay, we've delivered those requirements, we're good. And the regulators, regulators, no one at this point has all the answers for these technologies, and so people shouldn't be thinking that by complying with these regulations that they've done everything that's needed. I think they should still be spending a lot of time thinking about the governance and compliance within their own organizations and how they can constantly improve it, whether that's looking for bias, checking for fairness, whether it's acceptable uses of AI across the organization. I wouldn't kind of set the bar at the compliance with the regulations level, and I think that's where the potential misunderstanding might come from at this point.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. In the EU AI Act for high risk providers, or for high risk systems, one of the requirements is have sufficient cybersecurity measures to protect the system. Obviously, if it were that easy, you and I wouldn't really have jobs. So you do need to get several levels deeper in order to have a comprehensive program that is both compliant with the standard, but also protects against the threats that we've kind of discussed today and the emerging ones on the horizon. So as we move toward the conclusion of the show, I wanted to give you an opportunity to plug anything that you would like, other people's blogs, your blog, your open source projects, your company, whatever you'd like to plug. I'll turn it over to you and give you the chance to give that organization or those people a shout out.
Okay. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you to Johan Nashu from my team. So he's looking a lot at AI and governance, risk and compliance, and he was really helpful bouncing some ideas off and having some discussion as I prepared for this conversation. I think beyond that, I'd just encourage people to go out and build and try and experiment with these technologies and get a feel for how they work. So I think it's tempting to look at a Office 365 Copilot or a GitHub Copilot, use the product and appreciate it for what it is, but not really understand how it's working and what the potential risks are underneath it. And I think by building, it really helps to highlight where the potential areas are. So please go and have a look at my GitHub profile. You'll find some great examples of simple projects, some a bit more complex than others, but they leverage Gen AI. They deliver some quite practical use cases, whether it's for threat modeling, whether it's for generating incident response scenarios for testing. You can quickly see how this could be leveraged, and it will, by playing around with them and adapting them, forking them for your own project, then I think you'll learn a huge amount about how to build with these systems and where the potential pitfalls are. So that's MRW Adams on GitHub, or come and find me on LinkedIn, and you'll see it in my profile.
Awesome. So if I could summarize, it sounds like you're saying roll up your sleeves, get your hands dirty, and that'll be the way that you learn. So really appreciate you coming on the show. This has been a great discussion. We've touched on a lot of different topics, and your expertise has been greatly appreciated here. Great conversation, and look forward to seeing the continued work that you're going to do in the open source community. And I'm sure Citi understands that they are very lucky to have you there, and wish you the best of luck. To the audience, thank you very much for joining us. This has been the Deploy Securely podcast, and we will see you next time to discuss the intersection of cybersecurity, compliance, and privacy with AI. Thanks a lot.